Sub-jobs. There's a lot of them, well, mainly 12, 8 of them which you could get really early in. And because of that, there's a lot of variance in what you could put on your specific travelers, and you may find that you don't necessarily have a direction in what you're trying to accomplish with any specific traveler, or you may just not know how. And because of that, I'm here to make this video, or the video's already out because you're watching it. So yeah, we're going to be discussing all the sub-jobs in depth, who makes best use of what, an overview of each particular sub-job and what they are trying to accomplish, and just an overall review of what you're looking to get out of it. And with me today, I brought back Lunaire, or as you may know him as the one in Alley.
Hi there, yeah, thanks for having me, man. To those who watched the other Octopath video, you may recognize me. For those who don't, I'll just do another quick intro. My name is Ali, sometimes known as Luna in other communities. But I've been a big Octopath fan ever since the first game, and I'm really thrilled that we finally got our hands on the second to experience all it has to offer and chat with it here. If for any reason throughout this video you like the sound of my voice or you want to see more of me, I've got my own YouTube channel, which will probably be linked in the description. I upload sort of video discussion, video essay kind of things every once in a blue moon when I finally get one done. But I really strive for quality over quantity, so if you like the sound of that, then hey, check it out.
And yeah, that's what we're really here to do today. If you're only here for a specific sub-job, you could always skip around. We're going to have timestamps, and we're going to be making sure that if you don't want to get spoiled for some things over the other, then they're going to be marked accordingly. So I wouldn't really worry about that. So with that, we're going to start with the Warrior. The Warrior is a hyper-offensive job that really focuses on combat more than anything else. It lacks any support moves, so trying to give it to anybody that's more supportive innately isn't really going to be using it all too well, but it does have self-buffing moves such as Stout Wall and Abide, which can be used to just further bolster your overall combat, especially if you are lacking an early game buffer. But it also comes with a sword move, which can be used for breaking purposes, a spear move, which can be used for damage output, and another damage dealing move that pokes shields if the foe is targeting the specific warrior that's using the move, aka Vengeful Blade. It does have support skills in the form of just bolstering your combat even more through stuff such as a static physical attack boost, buffing your own physical attack if the foe is broken, or just increasing the threshold of damage for late game purposes, since chances are if you're playing with Warrior early game, you're not going to be doing 10,000 damage. And because of that, you definitely want to give this job to somebody that is more combat heavy oriented, or somebody that can go into that role. As for Hikari himself, who has the Warrior innately, he comes with his own personal EX skill in the form of Ultimate Stance, which can allow for AoE breaking purposes in just standard attacks or single target moves, but for the most part it may not necessarily see as much usage depending, since there's always a possibility that A, he may not necessarily be able to do enough damage with Ultimate Stance, and B, that if he's attempting to break a foe, or multiple foes, there's a good chance that they're not all going to be sharing a similar weakness, or a similar weakness that he can target. But that's pretty much just my thoughts when it comes to the Warrior itself. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you've hit a lot of the major points there. I mean, Warrior, I personally think is among the stronger of the sort of standard sub-jobs. Aggressive Slash is just such great coverage for sort of random target sword damage. Really powerful and sort of a really versatile move. The self-buffs are no doubt powerful, and I really am quite fond of this sort of package of Incite and Vengeful Blade. Those are two moves I sort of had quite low expectations coming from, and I remember personally for me, I started with Hikari, so initially I'm sort of comparing him to Olberic in the first game, and my thought was, oh, well, where's Cross Strike? Where's Spearhead? Sort of all these really valuable moves. But Vengeful Blade is one that, you know, just being able to reduce an enemy's shield points, regardless of their weak points, and sort of do that quite considerable damage with this counter is really something that I sort of began to understand the value of the more I was playing, especially when it comes to giving Warrior as a sub-job to other people. And then yeah, I think all your points about Ultimate Stance are pretty spot on. It's this sort of tricky situation where Hikari has really good AoE sort of combat ability thanks to his learned skills and also some skills he gets later on in the game. So yeah, taking a turn to set up a buff just to then do regular attacks against a group of enemies, it's not quite as appealing as perhaps it could be. But yeah, what are your thoughts on sort of what characters like Warrior sub-job? Because I've got my own. I've got some very very strong opinions.
Yeah, I bet you do. Obviously, you want somebody that can have a good amount of physical attack to make it work. And even through like late game or just throughout the game, you could always get geared to bolster it way more. But for the most part, if you already have a good physical attack, they're more than likely going to be having a much better time with it than somebody like Oswald. Even though we're going to be recommending Oswald because he has one particular thing that a lot of other travelers don't, and it's his ability to steal items, during night at least. He has a no risk, all reward move move in the sense of mugging, where if he's able to beat up an NPC, then he's able to steal every single item off them. And while this can be fine when you first start out, since he does have access to a good amount of elemental coverage, you'll find that throughout the game it may not necessarily be as good, since stats are going to vary all across the board throughout all sorts of NPCs, on top of general weaknesses being completely different. Some you may not even be able to target with his innate kit, since there's a total of 12 weaknesses that you can target. And because of that, giving him the warrior is not going to be a bad idea whatsoever. You can still boost it through just general means of equipment and accessories, and while I don't necessarily recommend bringing this for bosses, it is going to be pretty helpful for just dueling and fighting in general against NPCs, since there's going to be a way better chance at you stealing and mugging people with the warrior job than just any other job that he would get otherwise, because of stuff like Vengeful Blade, which can basically poke shields regardless of the weakness, and Stout Wall, which could boost up his physical defense a lot more, where he otherwise just would have got 1 or 2 shot. And because of his already naturally high elemental defense, he's not really going to be struggling on that front as much as he would on the physical defense side. So by making him a warrior, you can make mugging a lot easier. You can also give it to travelers such as Particio and Casti, who are definitely a bit more supportive in nature, but Particio is relatively balanced stat-wise across the board, so he can pretty much go into anything you really want him to do, and he'll find general success with it. And Casti follows a similar pattern. The only difference between these two, as opposed to all the other travelers, is that they already have a good amount of coverage as is. Particio starts out with polearms and bows, and by giving a warrior, he gets access to a third move in swords, where he'd otherwise only be able to get it through hired help, which is not going to be doing a lot of damage, especially later in. It's really going to be used for general buffs. And Cassie, who has axes innately and a pretty good amount of physical damage dealing moves in the form of Poison Axe and Sweep and Cleave, she already has a fair amount of physical attack to work with as is. So if you want her to do other things than just support through Concoct, you can make her into a solid damage dealer and just have mixed utility when your support is on cooldown. Especially if you need other travelers to break foes, it will work out pretty well. Otherwise, you have Ochet, who is still one of the best damage dealers in the game with Hikari, but with the added benefit of being able to use axes and bows innately, so by giving her warrior, she already has access to 4 physical weapon types. And it's especially good since the hunter does lock a fair amount of just general damage dealing moves, since outside of Cleaving Axe and Precise Shot, which is definitely going to be more useful for breaking than anything else, she lacks pretty much anything outside of what she can capture. So by giving her a warrior, she's going to be performing a lot better right out of the gate. And those are my thoughts when it comes to the traveler options at least, but I'm sure you have other travelers in mind.
Yeah, I mean, you hit a lot of the keynotes. I remember Oswald being my sort of weird idea that I remember messaging you about, and you're like, surely not, that can't work. And then next thing you know, it was, for every action, there's a reaction. His counterlines are so funny. But yeah, you know, Warrior Oswald's surprisingly effective when it comes to the duels, but all the others I think are pretty solid options. Ochet is no doubt the obvious one, right? You get 2 new weapons, you get access to some really powerful moves in aggressive slash and piercing thrust. The other thing to note as well is Enervating Slash is a really powerful move. There is a small mistranslation with this, where it actually nullifies positive stat effects on the user rather than on a foe. But what this means is if you combine it with sort of other classes that can provide the warrior a lot of buffs, clearing all those buffs can allow you to do a really powerful hit. Probably one of the few attacks that can rival sort of divine skill level strength early on. And I guess we never talked about the divine skill as well. Brand's Blade, just a very powerful single sword attack, is probably one of the moves that will start hitting the 9999 damage cap for you first. I guess another character that you could definitely recommend Warrior on would be Throne. Given her naturally high speed and sort of pretty decent physical attack, Warrior helps sort of match out her physical coverage really well because she's already got HP Thief for a 2-hit dagger. Match that with a sort of multi-hit sword attack that she can use to set up things like surprise attack on sword weak foes. She can definitely find a lot of value. Yeah, Warrior, just a really comprehensive, valuable physical attacking class. It's definitely among my sort of top 3 of the standard subjobs.
And I can see why. It does what it needs to do and it has a singular focus, whereas a lot of other classes may just end up being mixed in utility. You may find more value out of Warrior because it has one singular focus and it does it really, really well. Because of that, if you do want to give it to specific travelers, we do recommend that you give it to these 4. Although, again, for Oswald in particular, you may just want to use it for mugging rather than bringing it to any boss.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my main opinion on Throne is that she's kind of got a more specific role that suits her best, but we'll get into that later.
Oh, definitely. It's not one I would necessarily recommend over the other ones, but I do think you could still get some mileage out of it from Throne. Yeah, definitely. For now, we'll at least go on to the Dancer, which is way more supportive in nature comparatively to the Warrior. Although it does have a couple of moves that do damage or just break shield points, for the most part, it's definitely going to be focusing on support, since you have stuff like Lion Dance and Peacock Strut and a lot of other moves that just grant visible buffs, on top of the Divine skill, which extends the reach of it to pretty much everybody in the party, and support skills that can either extend it or further support party members through filling up their latent power gauge. What's also worth noting is that with Agnea in particular, by bringing in NPC, you can further bolster visible buffs than with any other Traveler with the Dancer class itself. But that doesn't mean it's not worth using on any other character. It just means that Agnea does have a lot more innate value with it comparatively to maybe any other Traveler with the Warrior sub-job. You'll probably get more mileage out of using Agnea with it in particular, but there's no reason why you wouldn't want to use it on any other character too if the situation calls for it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really relevant point. Agnea is definitely, of all the different sub-jobs, I think Dancer Agnea is just so much better than any other sort of Dancer, given that she has the ability to bring an ally in, which, for the record, you should always do. If anyone out there is using Agnea and, is maybe a little bit indifferent on her, just find a valuable ally, probably one that gives SP or a really valuable buff, and you'll notice using Lion Dance, Peacock Strut, even Dagger Dance being a sort of physical AoE attack. You can bring these allies in to permanently sort of buff your team again and again and again. It really adds up over time.
Which is why I do think if you do want to give it to any other Traveler, you may just want to focus on supportive capabilities and anything else it comes with. Especially since Agnea also has Windy Refrain, which is basically a super leg hold trap that only she can use. It deals wind-based damage to all foes and makes everybody act first on the next turn. So again, comparatively to something like Warrior, you're going to find a lot more innate value with the character who comes with the base job Dancer. Regardless, if you did want to give it to any other Traveler, you do have 3 worthwhile options in the form of Casti, Oswald, and Temenos. And I think Lunar has a really good reason as to why you would want to use the Dancer on any of these 3 in particular.
Yeah, I mean, Dancer really just being quite a versatile class with the support options. You can give it to anyone, but I think these 3 are your prime candidates. One thing to touch on real quick with Windy Refrain as well is being able to sort of manipulate speed control and sort of ally action order in this game is really valuable, especially considering breaking an opponent, you remove all of their actions completely. There's one support skill that we'll probably refer to a lot, but I think is going to come up sooner or later, is a step ahead. To those who don't recognize the name, you'll probably hear it quite a bit later. But to those who do know what it does, I absolutely have to recommend a step ahead with Agnea using Windy Refrain. What this does is it just allows all of your allies to act before any enemy right at the start of combat. It's such a powerful combo and really good for sort of rushing through fights, getting through shield gauges. But yeah, as you were saying, in terms of what characters really love Dancer as a sub-job, I think Oswald and Temenos are the 2 obvious ones. Dancer is one of the few jobs that gives elemental attack, and so anything that can bolster their elemental attack is naturally a good fit. Casti as well, it gives her a lot more support capability outside of what she can already do in Concoction. Because Concoctions, while they're incredibly powerful, they are quite demanding as far as BP, and early on when you've not got quite as many ingredients to justify using it all the time, it's nice to give her something else to do on those turns where your alternatives are probably, Poison Axe or a heal. Those buffs can just help give a bit more coverage.
You can also use it on characters such as Oswald and Temenos, not only because they have really good elemental attack, but for Oswald in particular, it's basically 4 elemental weaknesses covered, although the difference between what he has innately and what you get out of Dancer is that Sweeping Gale only targets a single foe, which is perfectly fine. However, if it comes down to fights where there's just multiple enemies, you're not going to get as much mileage out of it until there's only a single enemy left. Or if you're looking to break in general, it can still be useful, but just keep in mind that you're not going to get the same mileage out of it. Meanwhile, with Temenos, outside of just having general coverage with wind, he's able to benefit his party a lot thanks to a good amount of moves that he gets innately, including his EX skill, which we'll go into later, but for the sake of the discussion, he can essentially raise the HP cap over a single ally, and by giving him Sealtesia's Seduction from the Dancer class, he's able to extend it to every single ally. However, that also points to the argument that rather than giving it to Temenos, you run a separate Dancer instead, so that he could get it out much faster comparatively. But it's not necessarily bad whatsoever if he wants to be a bit more self-sufficient at the cost of just costing potentially an extra turn or 2.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. People who played Octopath 1 will recall that I think it was a support skill. Is there to sort of increase your max HP cap, and it was so powerful, especially for those late game fights. Whereas we don't have that support skill anymore, that Temenos sort of synergy with Steel Teacher's seduction is probably the next best thing, which is why Dancer is such an appealing option for him somewhere in the team.
And as a result, you could either run it on Temenos, or we could also recommend that running a separate Dancer is probably the better call. But I don't think you can necessarily go wrong with either. It just depends on how fast you could get these actions out without it being too much of a liability. So we discussed a sub-job that's purely offensive-based, we discussed another job that's mostly supportive-based, but what if we meshed the two together and got something that's a bit more chaotic? That's where we have the Merchant, who, just like Partitio, is basically balanced across the board in the sense that it could do basically anything, but you're not necessarily going to get the same mileage as you would from something that's focusing on one particular thing. You have a couple moves that could deal damage, one that targets physical defense and one that targets elemental defense. You have a couple of supportive or just weird miscellaneous ones, either that restores HP, SP, and a couple other things, as well as collect, which you just take money, but I don't think you're going to be struggling with money all too much, but you could still use it. You also have Donate BP, which is going to be the top echelon when it comes to Merchant in general, or supportive capabilities, because you can never have too much BP in general. And otherwise, you have Sidestep, which can come in handy, but you're not really going to be seeing as much mileage with it early in or even later in until you get something specific for it. But we'll go into that way later down the road. And otherwise, you have Hired Help, which worked similarly to how it was in 1, but it's a lot more varied now, as it can either provide stat buffs while dealing damage, shield poking, general SP restoration, and all sorts of other stuff. And for the most part, it's very good in what it's trying to accomplish. However, it will get pricey early in, so you may not necessarily find it to be as incentivizing when you're first starting out, but it will get better over the course of time.
Yeah, I think Merchant is a sub-job that is, you know, it's the go-to jack of all trades, master of none, right? What really sets it apart, though, is Donate BP. I think this is one of the premier support skills in the whole game. BP is in such high demand, and, you know, while sensible people will use their pomegranates instead of hoarding them like me, Donate BP is pretty much the next best thing. Hired Help has some really good support utility as well. You can access a lot of buffs that you sort of otherwise would only really find in the Thief class, as well as SP recovery, which is good. But of course, people will also know it as access to some very powerful attacks if you've got the price tag.
Yeah, for sure. And on the second note, when it comes to Donate BP, it's going to follow a similar situation with the Dancer, where you can still use it on a lot of other characters, but where Donate BP shines really fast is with Partitio, because he does have his latent power, which maxes out his BP immediately. So you can automatically give somebody 3-4 BP whenever you want, just at the start of the battle, which is really, really valuable, especially with his other support skills such as Boost Start, which grants him an additional BP at the start of battle. And you can give this to a lot of other characters to make the process of getting BP around the entire party much, much easier. Although you do have other stuff such as Grows on Trees, which can basically subsidize the amount of money loss that you're getting from either Hired Help or just buying stuff in general. Hang Tough, which can be nice in certain situations, but I don't think you're really going to be finding as much value here as you were in Octopath Traveler 1, because there are certain other abilities that make Hang Tough really, really good to begin with. And Full Power, which basically fills up the latent power gauge at the start of a battle, but you're not necessarily going to find it as useful unless you're doing long-term fighting. And because of that, you find that the Merchant is going to be your jack-of-all-trades class, which can work in a lot of scenarios, but it may not work in a lot of other ones. Still, it is good for mixed usage in offense and support, and you can still give this to a fair amount of travelers, whether that's Throne, Casti, Agnea, or Hikari.
Yeah, I think all of those are good options. Throne is probably my choice for a Merchant. It gives her access to 2 new weapons in Spear and Bow. It gives her access to a valuable support skill in Donate BP, to supplement what she already has in the Thief class, and she can also take advantage of the fact that she has a very high base speed. That, of course, being really important, because you want your Merchant to be acting before the people who need that BP, because Donate BP is only really valuable if you can give it before those powerful attacks. Casti and Agnea are other good options where it sort of complements the support playstyle a bit, but I don't know, do you have any thoughts on those two?
I think when it comes to general support, it might be fine. Cassie is already able to provide BP through Concoct, but it does cost ingredients, and you may end up running out of a lot of them if you keep using Concoct. So where the Merchant comes in is that you can still use other moves that allow her to act in combat while also having other means of getting BP around the party. So it can be useful in that regard, especially if you don't have your latent power immediately ready to go. And with Agnea, it's still more support that she can use, and while it doesn't necessarily allow her to act in combat much more often, especially since her physical attack isn't exactly the best, she does get access to fire magic from it, which means that if she does need a bit more coverage, or if she just needs to deal a bit more elemental attack or just elemental damage in general, it's not necessarily the worst.
You did remind me, actually, sort of talking about Castian giving her ways to give BP. I think the only place, I don't know if it is the only place, but the one place I've found where I can buy pomegranate leaves is the Beastling village on Totohaha, where they only trade for jerky, which means it's really hard to get a hold of them. So actually, it's a very fair point. Giving her ways to sort of provide BP more cheaply is a definite plus. Hikari, I think, is an interesting one as well, because the access to bows is nice, and Arrow of Fortune is there for sort of good JP. I think he does benefit from boost start quite a bit, and I can sort of touch on that a bit more later as well, since it allows him to sort of take advantage of his powerful sort of attacks in his latent power. Probably things like Tenretsuzan or Sugetsusen early on, given that those are sort of big DPS options. But Hyanka is one that gets a lot of value later on, once you start getting these powerful options like Brand's Blade, as well as some learned skills that he can get in his story.
Yeah, definitely. And because of that, I do think Hikari can use the Merchant fairly well. Even though there are obviously going to be more offensive options ready for him in other jobs, it's not necessarily bad whatsoever and can still work to his own benefit.
And also a very relevant point there, I think, is just boost start as a support skill. For the most part, I find the Merchant's support skills pretty mediocre. Full power is the one that I think a lot of people will look at and think, that seems quite strong. But realistically, latent power gauge is only being able to refill that is only really relevant for regular combats. And personally, there are some other support skills later on that I think, or rather that we'll discuss later on, that I think are a bit more relevant for that and a bit more useful. Full power has no real advantage in a boss fight, for example, because chances are you're going into that with a full latent power gauge anyway. Boost start, on the other hand, I think is the one exception. This is a skill that I think is pretty easy to get early on, and just having anyone with 1 BP extra at the start of battle can be really powerful. It's one of the reasons a certain support skill that we've already touched on already, but we'll no doubt go into in detail later on, is really appealing. Not only for sort of short combats where, you know, having that extra point of BP means you can dish out a powerful attack and, you know, sweep aside some enemies really easily, but also for boss combats where being able to set up those powerful synergies, often with things like divine skills, becomes really important.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. You could always still run Particio by himself with the Merchant class, especially since he does have access to Negotiate Schedule, which is one of those weird cases where it may be really broken in a vacuum, but depending on when you get it and how far into the game you are with resources, you may find that it's not necessarily something that you want to use by himself. Really, it's the latent power that is going to make him a lot more valuable than a lot of other merchants because he's able to max out his BP whenever he needs to max it out. Still, for what it's worth, Negotiate Schedule of being able to take over any enemy action by paying a huge amount of money, or depending on the fight, can be very useful. I just don't see it being useful early in, since money in general is going to be a bit more limited comparatively. But for the most part, you could pretty much get away with a merchant on a lot of other characters. Unlike the Scholar, which scales off elemental attack, and to be fair, a lot of characters can always just bolster it through accessories and gear, which is totally fair and fine, but you're going to find that for the most part, you're going to want to use this on characters that already have an innately high elemental attack stat. And when it comes down to those Traveler options, it's really just going to be Temenos and Agnea. Outside of potentially Particio, who again is balanced across the board, you're still not going to be seeing as much utility from maybe Particio as a magic damage dealer as you would with any other high elemental attack character. So for what it's worth, you may just want to use this on someone like Temenos or Agnea. It is, again, very specialized in what it's trying to do. You get access to 3 moves that target each respective element, including fire, ice, and lightning. You do have Elemental Barrage, which is the same thing, but it randomly targets foes. And while the move by itself may not be anything particularly great, it will be especially useful for someone like Temenos because of his latent power, but we'll get into that in a second. Outside of just general damage output, you do have other moves in the form of Analyze and Stroke of Genius, which can just help bolster yourself and just show weaknesses off foes if you couldn't already find them out through other means. And you also have the support skills, but those will also vary in viability and usage depending on what you're trying to accomplish with them. Although I think, Lunar, you might have a better idea of what you can use with these over other support skills.
Sure, Scholar's a really interesting one because I think as a sub-job in isolation, it's probably got the most synergistic set of base skills out of all of them. You know, you've got 3 elemental coverage, you've got Elemental Barrage, which has a myriad of fun synergies that I can't wait to sort of get into. The one sort of problem I often encounter with this class is it feels like for regular combats, the AoE is incredibly potent, and it can pretty much, wipe regular combats on its own if you've got a strong enough scholar. But when it comes to boss encounters and sort of situations where you need more single target damage output, you really become dependent on things like Oswald's latent power or access to things like advanced magic and Elephant's wisdom. But as for the support skills, I think they're an interesting bunch. Evasive maneuvers is no doubt one that people will be very familiar with, an absolute godsend for speedruns, but even for regular play, it's something that never feels bad, sort of running it when you need it. Elemental augmentation, I think, is one of the better sort of stat up support skills, because generally elemental attack is going to be a bit harder to come by compared to something like physical attack or any defensive stats. X-ray experience is nice, but has no real sort of impact for battle. And then advanced magic master, I think, is particularly relevant when it comes to later on, and when your spells start to really rely on things like Elephant's wisdom. This will just give an extra charge whenever you use one of those. So it's really quite valuable in terms of sort of minimizing the amount of setup you need to hit that sort of peak performance as far as damage output is concerned.
For sure, and I do think Scholar does follow a similar status to the Warrior in the sense that you could pretty much run this on a lot of other Travelers, and you won't necessarily see as much of a difference than running the base Traveler who has Scholar innately, as they do have the EX skill in Teach, which can be useful in some scenarios, since it does grant a single ally your own attributes for a certain amount of turns, depending on how much you boost. But that's really all it boils down to in the end. There isn't anything like Windy Refrain that Oswald has to make them stand out way more comparatively, and they do have Analyze, which is really convenient for figuring out weaknesses much more quickly, but I don't think it's necessary in the long term, especially if you have an idea of how weapons are structured. And because of this, I do find that by giving Scholar to a lot of other Travelers, you may not necessarily see as much of a difference, although Oswald does have the highest elemental attack out of any Traveler. In terms of general usage, the only bar of entry is going to be your elemental attack stat, which Temenos and Agnea do have a good amount of.
Yeah, I have to talk about this now. I cannot resist it any longer. I know that a lot of people will be familiar with Temenos as a really good example of a good sort of a character that can utilize the Scholar subjob well. And the reason for that, for anyone who doesn't know, is Elemental Barrage. What this is based on boost level, a sort of high number of random fire, ice, or lightning based hits. And when you combine that with Temenos' latent power, which will break regardless of what hit you do, it allows you to break enemies with really high shield gauges really easily. What I think a lot of people don't know is that for some reason, Elemental Barrage also works with Agnea's latent power. And Agnea's latent power is basically Seal Tiege's Seduction. So if you've ever got a situation where it demands it, you can give Temenos Seal Tiege's Seduction, use his latent power, and a max boost Elemental Barrage can do 6 to 8 hits on a huge group of enemies and break all of them. It's so fun, but I just wish it were actually more practical in most combats.
It can be practical if you give it to Temenos, because he also has his own latent power which pokes shields regardless of the attack used. So if you were able to Seal Tiege Seduction onto him, he can break every enemy if he max boosts, because chances are if you're that early in, or just throughout pretty much almost every fight, you're not going to find that a lot of enemies have 6 to 8 shield points to begin with. Obviously there are exceptions, especially in bosses, but otherwise Temenos with the Seal Tiege's Seduction support is going to be really, really beneficial for just shield poking in general, which is why he could also use this really, really well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I had to draw attention to because I think Seal Tiege's Seduction is something that already benefits Temenos a lot, given the sort of clear synergy with Cleric skills that we'll probably get into in a moment. But on the off chance that anyone is sort of aware of that synergy, is running him as a Scholar, you might find some fun there. Either way, it's very entertaining to sort of hit the entire field of enemies for 6 to 8 times, breaking them all. I guess another point on Scholar that I think is fair to point up is the synergy that you've got between Stroke of Genius and Oswald's exclusive skill Teach. It's a bit of a hard sell because being able to grant random attribute raising effects and then give them to an ally is very strong, but realistically, given that these buffs are random, given that Teach will only sort of either give 2 buffs for 5 turns if you max boost Teach, or if you max boost Stroke of Genius, you're only giving it for 2 turns, it's often not very practical and only really something that you'll do if you don't have any weaknesses you can exploit with Oswald. One valuable thing though, I can't remember if we mentioned it, but if not, we can talk about it here, is if you use Stroke of Genius to get a lot of buffs, teach that onto a warrior, and then they can use Elevating Slash with loads of different effects that they can get rid of for bonus damage. It's probably one of the more consistent damage outputs you can do before you get access to things like Brand's Blade, some specific learned skills, or very much down the line, an exclusive skill from Hikari. But it's a good damage option if you ever find yourself in need of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even though the Scholar is very centralized in what it's trying to accomplish, akin to the Warrior, it is still relatively limited because you do need that elemental attack and just general synergy with basically your base job and a lot of other stuff. And for what it's worth, the Scholar is still a very good class. It's just that you may not find as much usage out of it as maybe a lot of other jobs on a lot of other Travelers.
Yeah, I would agree. Scholar's in this weird spot where the AoE damage is fantastic, but oftentimes it feels like Warriors or even Hunters can not only match it, but surpass it when it comes to single target damage. Nevertheless, I think Scholar has some really fun things going for it, and it'll always find use, you know, even if it's just going up against a new boss and relying on Analyze to check the weak points, you'll always find something that you can do with this skill set.
Meanwhile, with the Cleric, you'll find that it's generally useful no matter what, because healing's always good, and you also have a lot of other supportive capabilities in the form of Prayer to the Flame and Mystical Staff, although Mystical Staff is more so for breaking and acts as SP Thief from Octopath Traveler 1. It is good for just general SP regeneration for even more supportive capabilities, as well as Sacred Shield, which can be used to basically reduce the amount of damage from an incoming attack for a fixed amount depending on how much it's boosted. Although you do have the ability in Alfric's Blessing, which does grant a single ally the ability to act again at the end of a turn for 3 turns, which is always going to be beneficial because the more actions you have, the better chance you're going to be able to deal with a fight much more easily.
Yeah, Cleric I think is a very potent sub-job, whereas Scholar is very much more specialized in sort of elemental attack and damage dealing, and therefore really feels best on Oswald, but less so on everyone else. Cleric I think is a class that pretty much anyone can do well with, but the characters that really do enjoy it adore this sub-job. As you mentioned, Mystical Staff, it's a really powerful thing. It's kind of stolen the Thieves role a little bit from the first game, but generally casters I think are going to have much more demand for that SP, so I'm glad to see it here. A lot of the other Cleric skills look pretty self-explanatory. You know, Heal Wounds is there to heal, you've got some light coverage that's nice. But Sacred Shield, I think, is something that is quite easy to sleep on. Worth noting that sort of the language it uses is reduce damage taken from the next hit by however much you boost it. If the next hit is a multi-hit, the shield won't go down until that attack is finished. Meaning, any bosses where you know you've got a sort of series of blows in one round that you need to be prepared for, this is something that can help mitigate that damage immensely. It's incredibly powerful as a result. And as you alluded to as well, Elfric's Blessing, it just lets Cleric do more of what it wants to do. Being able to take an extra turn is valuable for so many situations. Merchant loves this because of Donate BP. Dancer loves this because of maintaining buffs with Seal Tiege, either on itself or someone else. And Cleric, of course, loves this because being able to heal more consistently, and also just the versatility, you know, this can include items, this can include reviving if you need to, because it's there whenever the situation demands.
Yeah, definitely. Which is why I do think if you do want to run any sort of sub-job, having a Cleric around on either team is always going to be beneficial. You do have Temenos who has it innately, but having a second healer for maybe a second team is never a bad idea whatsoever. Especially since you can have a fair amount of synergy with a lot of other characters. It is worth noting that the healing does scale off elemental defense, so similarly to how the Scholar is with elemental attack, you do want to have a fair amount of elemental defense. The issue here, though, is that outside of Temenos, who has it innately, the only other characters that you could use this remotely well with is going to be Oswald, Particio, and Casti, because everybody else is very poor when it comes to their elemental defense, all tied with the lowest amount. Because of that, these are the only 3 I would absolutely recommend. Oswald because he does have good synergy with his fire, lightning, and ice magic, so adding a 4th element is always a good idea. On top of just more general support, it's never bad whatsoever. Casti can also use this well, even though she is more physical attack oriented. She does have a fair amount of elemental defense, and she could use the healing capabilities and supportive capabilities of the Cleric to also subsidize the amount of concoct she has to use comparatively, since it does end up being cheaper in the long run. And with Particio, he is the most balanced of the group, but does serve well just because he is already supportive in nature. Even though the merchant is a jack of all trades class, it is something that you can still take advantage of because you could still go into either direction, either in physical and offensive capabilities or something that's more supportive, especially with Donate BP in tow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are all good recommendations, and I think it's worth drawing attention to the support skills on Cleric as well. Resilience is one that I think is probably a staple for anyone that's looking to do a lot of healing. Though also worth noting that this does apply to items as well. What this does is just increase the amount of HP that a character gets when they're healed. So it can sometimes be relevant in situations where you've got someone dueling and you need to have them constantly eating healing grapes because they're taking so much damage. Inner Strength is another one that I think is quite interesting. Given that these two are sort of the first and second support skills that you'll get, I think there's often an argument for, learning Inner Strength, getting another max SP of 50, and putting that on characters that are otherwise quite SP hungry, like Oswald particularly, but also Hikari is an option that, as someone who started with Hikari, I found a lot of value from. Given that SP is something that base stats don't cover a lot of. The other two support skills are a lot more situational, mainly they're for filler, but I think those two, Inner Strength more so for early game, but Resilience is definitely one that I can see being a staple on supports.
Yeah, definitely. And because of that, we really do recommend just using the Cleric on supports in general. Still, you could use a fair amount of these support skills in other scenarios where it would prove useful. But for the Cleric job itself, you definitely want to make it more supportive oriented. So for stuff such as Oswald, Cassie, and Particio, they're more than likely going to be your best options. Even though Oswald is still more offensive focused, he can still cover an additional element because of it.
Absolutely, and it's worth mentioning as well that Cleric is one of the few other subjobs that can get use out of Advanced Magic and Elephant's Wisdom. I think the heal, the AoE light, and also the revive will all be augmented by the sort of upgraded tiers that Scholar has access to. And another one I have to draw attention to, I know we talked about it a little bit on one of the other classes, but Temenos' exclusive skill, Prayer for Plenty. For those who don't know what this does, is it's just a single target ally heal where it will ignore your max HP and overheal them beyond their max. If they're already above their max, it won't have any effect. So it's important that you try and get this in early and then top it up whenever they dip below. But this is another reason that, Cleric is really, really looking for someone to give it something like Seal Teacher's Seduction, so that you can extend these effects across the whole party.
And then we have the Thief job, which does follow a similar situation to the Merchant, where it does have a fair amount of support and offensive capabilities. However, comparatively to Merchant, I find that the offensive capabilities of Thief are much more lackluster than what you would get out of Merchant. And rather than using Thief as an offensive subjob, you're better off using it for supportive capabilities. You do have HP Thief, which is a double hitting dagger move, which is always going to be beneficial for general damage output or breaking if you really need it, as well as Aber's Reckoning, which can just deal a lot of damage if charged up with BP. However, I find that it's really going to shine with Armor Corrosive and Shackle Foe, which are the only two supportive options that you get from Thief, but it's arguably what carries the job the most, because it doesn't really have anything else much more compelling. Armor Corrosive and Shackle Foe reduce the physical defense and physical attack of the foe respectively for X amount of turns depending on how much you boost. And because of that, if you do need to face tank physical attacks, it's going to be much easier to do so, and if you need to deal a lot more damage way faster, then Armor Corrosive is going to be really, really good, especially when paired with something like Warrior, which targets physical defense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Thief is in this odd spot coming from the first game where, I guess for a bit of background, my starting character in Octopath 1 was Therion, and Therion was, I think, a really valuable character in that game because not only did you have these sort of staple skills of Shackle Foe and Armor Corrosive, but you also had things like SP Thief and SP Share. So while his buffing or rather debuffing role was there, he also had a lot more sort of team-wide utility as well as really good consistent damage output because he could use SP Thief and constantly refresh his ability to use that skill. Unfortunately, the same can't be said this time around. And so while I think Thief still has good physical damage output, I don't know, having started with Hikari, it feels like something where starting with Throne, you'll think her damage output is great and you'll love to give her things like Warrior or Hunter subjob to really push that to the limit. But as just another member of the team, I think she does more easily slip into this support role where you're mainly using her for breaking dagger weak enemies and then these debuffs. The support skills are a little bit underwhelming as well. You've got sort of percentage chances to retaliate when using buffs. You've got a flat speed increase. But yeah, with that said though, Thief, I think, still has a role in a lot of teams, mainly because debuffs are otherwise quite hard to come by. Examples that come to mind of sort of other sources of debuffs would be, I think, Hired Help is one option, and then the others are actually monsters that come from Ochet. Thief is arguably one of the more accessible and more consistent options for debuffing foes, which when you're trying to maximize damage output is definitely very valuable.
100%. And because of that, the only reason I would ever want to give this to any Traveler for offensive capabilities is because they have weapon coverage with it. As the Thief class does grant swords and daggers, giving it to somebody like Ochet and Particio means that you have 4 physical weakness covered with both of them. Particio in particular, you make it into support if you just need to break something. And with Ochet, at least you still have HP Thief, which can be really, really good. And if you wanted to make Ochet into a bit of support, you could still use Leg Hold Trap with Armor Corrosive and Shackle Foe and just become one big debuff bot, which is really convenient there. You also have Hikari, who could still use something like HP Thief and Surprise Attack if you really need something just for general damage output, and the occasional Armor Corrosive if you just want to maximize your damage output, although I do recommend that you may as well just run somebody else with it at that point. Still, for what it's worth, you do get HP Thief out of it, which is still a good hard-hitting move, especially with someone like Hikari and Ochet.
Yeah, ironically, I think Thief Hikari was one of my most used Traveler subjob combinations. The main reason being my go-to team for a lot of things included Casti and Agnia, alongside Hikari, who was my main. And because of that, it meant I often had access to the sort of augmenting buffs to boost his attack. But what I didn't have access to was a debuff. So oftentimes it would be breaking an enemy really early on in the turn, using Hikari's first action to debuff, and then the second to really focus on getting my damage output. In addition, I think one of the big merits of Thief is its ability to be useful with extra turns. And that can be things like Throne's Latent Power is the obvious example, but also as someone that can benefit from Elfric's Blessing, or in the case of Hikari, what I used a lot was to synergize with Hienka. Obviously with Hienka, it's something that you ideally want the debuff out sooner rather than later. Being able to debuff, use Hienka for a bit of damage output, and then get that bonus turn to really maximize your BP helps give a bit more value to the class in those situations.
Yeah, which is why I do think if you do plan to run Thief on anybody, you may want to give it to somebody who is already supportive innately or can afford to use it without the cost of minimizing on your offensive capabilities. And while you could still use it on somebody like Hikari, I find that you might be better off using it on somebody like Ochet, Particio, or Agnea. Especially Agnea, since she could provide additional support with what she already has innately in the form of the Dancer class.
Yeah, very fair point. The other thing, of course, we've not touched on yet is Throne's exclusive skill, which is Veil of Darkness. This is something, I'll admit, I think my first time going to Clockbank, I sort of made note of, oh yeah, the Thief Shrine is right over there. I'll go to Clockbank and I'll come back and grab it in a moment. And just completely slipped my mind. I think I got this skill for Throne probably around finishing most people's stories. But honestly, it's not something that I felt like I was missing out on. It's nice to have an AoE dark attack that you can access quite early, mainly for the coverage. And dodging a physical attack is nice, but for a 25 SP cost, it just doesn't really do enough. I could maybe see some use if you go for like a really magic-oriented Throne build, but I don't know, it's a bit of a hard sell for me. But yeah, is there anything else you want to talk about with Thief, or should we move on to Hunter?
I do think it's worth noting that you can get early access to weapons that grant additional dark damage. So for what it's worth, if you did want to do additional damage with Veil of Darkness or Darkest Night, you can if you really need to. But for the most part, I find that you're more so going to be focusing on your physical output, since chances are that's going to be a lot more consistent in damage. Yeah, that sounds good to me. We go on to the Hunter class, which again follows a similar route to Thief, where it can do a bunch of things, but I also think it's very directionless in what it's trying to accomplish more so than any other class. It does have Precise Shot and Cleaving Blow for damage output, although Cleaving Blow is going to be a lot better since Precise Shot seems to be more focused on breaking than general damage output. Even though it could potentially deal a fair amount of damage, I find that Cleaving Blow is just going to be doing a lot better. However, you still have other duds in the form of Mercy Strike, which can still be good for capturing beasts, but that's all it's ever going to serve. And a Abating Orb, which is never really going to be coming into effect too often, or at least to the point where you could just break and remove it, or debuff it through other means. Otherwise, you have Take Aim and Leg Hold Trap, which are more supportive innately. The former raising the amount of critical rate every ally has, and Leg Hold Trap delaying the actions of an enemy for an X amount of turns, which is still very, very helpful in what it's trying to accomplish, but with Windy Refrain, you may not necessarily get the same value out of it as maybe you would have gone with Leg Hold Trap. However, if you pair it with any other thief, it's going to be good for supportive capabilities in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Hunter's in this weird situation where many of the skills are there to complement Ochette and what she wants to do with her talent in terms of capturing monsters and then using them in combat. The problem is then when you give Hunter subjob to someone else, you just don't find a lot of use from many of the skills. I think Mercy Strike and Abating Orb I didn't use once in any point in my playthrough. And partly, I think, because of that as well, Mercy Strike loses a lot of value in this kit when you consider that Ochette can capture monsters automatically this time, which is not something that Harnett could do in the first game. Regardless, looking at the rest of the kit, Precise Shot is your equivalent of Aggressive Slash in Hunter kits. The advantage being that you can choose your targets, albeit with one hit fewer. It's good for breaking, and it can be good for bow weak enemies, but it's mainly there as a sort of coverage, potential AoE if you need it. Cleaving Blow, I think, is a really interesting one. I couldn't find many sort of consistencies in what positive status effect this would give depending on the enemy. I was thinking, is it based on, you know, if an enemy is aquatic or sort of like inorganic or something like that, but it seems like a throw it out at some point in combat, see what advantage you get, and if that bonus is ever useful later on, then you can use it again. But for the most part, it's just strong axe single target. The other one I do want to draw attention to is Ochette's exclusive skill, Indomitable Beast. What this does is increases physical attack, evasion, and speed for quite a few turns if you boost it quite considerably. And this, paired with Take Aim, can give, I think, 5 different buffs for quite a few turns if you sort of set them up properly. And that can be very powerful for, once again, Warrior's niche but powerful move in Enervating Slash. Ochette can sort of give a number of considerable buffs quite easily. It's probably one of the most consistent setups to get several buffs. But yeah, Hunter's a valuable class. I think the weapons that it offers are also, you know, your other options include Apothecary, which is good. In some cases I would prefer it, but Bow, your only other option is Merchant, which if you're giving someone Merchant, chances are you're just using them for donate BP, so Hunter does have its uses for sure, and I think the support skills are an interesting thing to touch on as well.
Yeah, definitely. The Hunter does have a lot of aspects to it that can make it fit into several roles, but chances are you're more than likely going to be using it either on Ochette innately, who uses pretty much everything to every single benefit whenever needed, or you're just going to be using it for supportive capabilities, since there's a good chance that if you really wanted to use it for damage output, you have a lot of other options available to you. Still, with stuff like Cleaving Blow that can still do a fair amount of damage, Thunderbird which deals lightning damage, and Precise Shot which could be really good for breaking in general, you're more than likely not going to be getting as much offensive capabilities out of it. Maybe outside of Salt in the Wound, which does grant a 50% chance of acting twice when you break a foe, which is really, really good in its own right, especially if you are trying to maximize a fair amount of damage output, or if you just want to set up more and more, especially when paired with other sub-jobs. Still, for what that's worth, you can still give it to a fair amount of travelers, since again, it isn't exactly set in stone in what it's trying to accomplish, but it doesn't exactly do amazing things one way or the other. You can still give it to characters such as Throne and Agnea for the supportive capabilities, Throne definitely being the highlight on that front, since you can have a combination of Leg Hold Trap, Shackle Foe, and Armor Corrosive, and when getting enough SP to learn Salt in the Wound, you could just act more supportively by setting up more debuffs, which is always really, really good. Meanwhile, with Agnea, you could still give it to her for more supportive capabilities in tandem with Dance, since Leg Hold Trap is very, very good in its own right, although Windy Refrain does make it a bit moot since it moves everybody's actions up to the next turn immediately. However, with Leg Hold Trap, it does last for several turns, whereas Windy Refrain, you will have to use it for multiple turns in succession to always go first. However, outside of that, you can still use it for precise shot breaking, which is always going to be very, very good. Hikari can still use it for getting more access to additional weapon types since he only comes with swords and polearms, and by giving him the hunter class, he could get access to axes and bows, which could be really beneficial in the long term since he'll be able to access stuff like Cleaving Blow and Drifandi's bow, which are just really good for damage output. And otherwise for Casti, it's again going to be another one of those mixed utility cases where outside of support with Concoct and a couple of the moves from the hunter class, she can still use stuff like Precise Shot for breaking and Cleaving Blow, which can potentially come in handy if you are able to get the right buff, but that's complete RNG at that point, unless you have a whole list of enemies, which you're not going to have.
Yeah, it occurs to me we haven't talked much about Drifandi's bow, but I think it is a pretty potent ability. You know, being able to unleash a strong bow attack on all foes 3 times, it does mean you can sweep through regular combats pretty easily with this skill. The main issue I find in sort of general use is that regular combat's great, mainly if it's a sort of bow weak enemy, but beyond those situations, when you're up against things like bosses or sort of strong single enemies that aren't weak to bow, it doesn't justify the SP cost. So much like a lot of the hunter skills, in the situations where it's strong, it's really strong and really potent. But outside of those situations, it struggles to find a lot of use. But also, as you alluded to as well, I think Salt the Wound is a really big highlight from this class. Being able to just act again after breaking a foe can enable so many little advantages that, you know, going without it does make a big difference. It does have some consistency issues, but, you know, being able to break with a thief and get another action to then set up a debuff, you know, that can add so much damage to the rest of your party. Or breaking an enemy when you're suddenly getting overwhelmed by attacks and then using that extra damage to maybe revive someone or just help stabilize. Maybe use an energizing pomegranate to set up someone's damage. It's just such a powerful support skill that I think damage dealers can really get a lot of value on. Or characters that are very much specialized to be breaking, like Temenos is a great example.
And because of that, I do think if you are going to use Hunter, you may want to focus more so on its supportive capabilities. Although, again, it is still relatively mixed in what it's trying to accomplish. I find that it's not really the best when it comes to a lot of stuff in general. But if you do need somebody that can act supportively and can deal a fair amount of damage, such as Throne, then I do think it's going to be a worthwhile job to put on any of these travelers.
There are 2 other things I do want to make quick mention to. One is that Ochet will often be your main hunter with access to all these different effects. This mainly refers to Indomitable Beast, but it's worth noting that Ochet, with any buffs that she receives, those won't have any impact on her monster summon attacks. As far as I'm aware, those are completely unaffected by buffs. So, if to all those people looking to set up Indomitable Beast and then hit a really powerful attack with a Beast of Legend, I'm afraid that's not quite going to work. The other one is in reference to Leg Hull Trap. We've made a lot of sort of comments around Leg Hull Trap and Windy Refrain in particular. Being able to manipulate enemy action order can be a really powerful thing in this game. It is something that you need to use with consideration, though. This is particularly true for Windy Refrain, but also for Leg Hull Trap, is ending up in a situation where you stack enemy turns in one part of the action order. As you progress sort of more into mid-game and later on in the game, enemies will start getting 2, 3, even upwards of 4 actions in one turn in some of the toughest combats. And if you're there using Leg Hold Trap or Windy Refrain and stacking all of those attacks at one point in the combat, chances are if you've not got really good defensive capabilities set up, you're going to get taken out. So just something to consider with those skills. They are really powerful in the right situations, but you need to make sure you don't get yourself trapped in a situation where you have to face so many attacks and you don't have an answer for it.
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly. It does have its benefits, but it has massive drawbacks if not careful. So it is something you just have to consider when using it.
Great, so now we can come on to my favorite class, I think. So, Apothecary, this is Casti's class. This is a really interesting class in my opinion because in terms of its base stats, it's quite physically leaning, but then you look at its skills and it's kind of got something to offer for everyone. Healing Touch is a really cheap and really versatile skill because you can use it for healing but also reviving. This means that characters leaning towards support like it, but it's also just kind of useful in every situation. Icicle is there for a bit of ice coverage. Rehabilitate is there for your status immunities and works wonders alongside things like Seal Tige in certain combats. And then you've got this sort of axe and damage package of the subjob. You've got Sweeping Cleave, which is just an axe attack against all foes. This is something I found a lot of use for really early on. You know, using Sweeping Cleave to sweep through regular combats with an AoE. You know, for characters that are otherwise locked to sort of single target, Ochette being another good option, just having this cheap, accessible AoE option is really good. Other than that, you've got this interesting package of Poison Axe and Weak to Poison, where you can set up this weakness to kind of chip away at enemy shields, even if they've got all their other weaknesses locked, or if you don't have a way of targeting them. It's a little bit situational, but Poison Axe is generally something that I found to be more consistent than I was expecting, mainly in terms of damage output and how regularly I could actually apply poison to a boss. You know, it's the kind of thing I was expecting a lot of bosses to be immune to, but then was pleasantly surprised that they weren't. Other than that, the Divine Skill Dota's Charity, I think, is arguably the strongest Divine Skill in the game. Just being able to extend items to the entire party. There are some really powerful items in the game. You know, any of the jams, especially the more potent ones, being able to use those on the entire party is incredible. It's mainly just, you know, the BP cost to get it set up, and then the fact that you are using consumables, some of which might be a bit rare. But nevertheless, it's such a powerful tool to have in your kit that I think makes Apothecary really appealing. What are your thoughts on the main job skills?
I think when it comes to the main job skills, I do agree that you just have a lot of versatility when you're trying to accomplish basically anything. One of the recommended ones that we did initially was Hikari, because you do get Sweeping Cleave and Poison Axe, which are just two really good axe hitting moves. But then also with just general support, you have stuff like Healing Touch, Rehabilitate, and obviously Dota's Charity, which can be really, really good, especially if you're like me and you just store every single item you've ever had, ever, for maybe to use at the final boss, maybe. But in my opinion, it falls less into the Thief and Hunter role and more into the Merchant side of being able to be used in a lot of scenarios and having much more success in something that is just generally weaker comparatively. So if you were to give this to someone like Hikari, even though you're not going to be really getting the supportive capabilities as much out of it, you could still use something like Sweeping Cleave and Poison Axe, which are just really good for damage output. You could also use it on Particio, who can be very supportive in nature, or anything you want, because again, he is your jack of all trades, and because of that, he could pretty much take advantage of pretty much every single skill here if needed, because he can act supportive when he needs to. He has Donate BP, he has Hired Help, he has all that stuff, but then he also has polearms and bows, so adding axes to that means he could just have better damage output if you just don't want him to be your support bot. But then you also have Agnea and Throne, who can also use this very supportively, because even though Thief can work in both scenarios, we find that the Thief is just better supportively than offensively. So by giving it to someone like Throne or Agnea, both of which who are more than likely going to be your support bots, you can still get very good mileage out of it, especially Throne, who can take 2 actions to use Dota's Charity and then extend the reach to pretty much everybody in a single back-to-back action, which is really, really strong.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Throne is an interesting one as well, because the Thief sub-job is completely devoid of any AoE, and because Throne is lacking in something like learned skills that Hikari has, you're not fixing that from anything other than sub-jobs. So really your 2 options are Dancer and Apothecary. Dancer with Dagger Dance and Apothecary with Sweeping Cleave. And of the 2, I think Apothecary is definitely one that Throne finds a lot more success with, given that you're giving her a different weapon type and just generally a bit more of a sort of physical attacking inclination compared to Dancer. The other one I really want to draw attention to is Vigorous Victor, which is the first support skill you get on this. And what this does is, every time you win a combat, you restore 30% of your max HP and SP. I found this support skill to be invaluable in the early game, mainly because all of those sort of SP-hungry characters like Oswald, Hikari, characters that want to dish out sort of strong AoE attacks to sweep through regular combats and, you know, just make light of them. You know, really need a lot of SP to make that happen. And Vigorous Victor is there, you just put it on one character, and all of a sudden, they are your solution for every regular combat, provided they're strong enough to clear it easily. It's such a potent support skill that really just is more convenience than anything, I suppose, given that, you know, using Healing Grapes and Inspiriting Plums can do the same thing, but I found this to be so valuable on those characters that without it would just run out of SP after a few combats. And given that it's the first support skill available as well, you really don't need to invest a lot to get it, which makes it more appealing to put on characters that you otherwise might not run Apothecary on.
I do think it does have that value, because chances are, if you're just playing through the game, you're going to run into several enemies before you get to like that big bad boss. And because of that, you can always just you could just save resources a lot more comparatively than entering multiple battles, healing a bit, entering more battles, and then getting to the boss. Because if you do run away, I mean, that does solve one of the issues, but you may not be able to do that in every scenario. So by having access to Vigorous Victor, you can make it so your general resources and sustainability is just a lot higher, and can potentially cut down on the amount you're spending in general. Although by getting to late game, you'll probably not have that issue anyway, but for early game and maybe through a bit of mid game, you'll find that it's going to be very, very good.
Yeah, absolutely. As for the rest of the Apothecary support skills, I think they kind of lose a bit of interest compared to Vigorous Victor. Hale and Hearty is just a max 500 HP, which is nice if you've already invested the JP to get to Vigorous Victor. It can be nice early game filler for when you just want to make someone a bit more durable. Oswald especially is one that comes to mind. Inspiriting Break and Preventative Measures, they're nice, they're alright, but really they feel like filler until you're kind of dabbling in lots of different subjobs to pick up specific support skills. But for while you have them, they're nice to add.
And because of that, the only 4 travelers, which is still a fair amount outside of like the one that comes with the Nail, that's 4 out of 7. You can still use on Hikari, Portitio, Agnea, and Throne, and you'll probably get the best mileage out of that. And really, that's what it's going to be when it comes to all the standard sub-jobs. Unless you have anything else to add, I think we covered pretty much all of the base stuff.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I think we've done a good job of sort of painting a picture of all of these different subjobs. And, you know, whether you're a new player sort of trying to get to grips with all of these different options you have when building your team and your characters, or whether you're someone who's quite experienced with all the different options you have at your disposal, I think just looking at all of these jobs and thinking about what skills best match what a character is trying to do or what they're missing is really what you're going to have the most success with.
For those who really were interested in just the 8, you can exit the video now if you want to. We're going to be going into the spoiler territory of the 4 hidden jobs, although the first one is really easy to get and you can get it very early in. Still, if you're not interested and you'd rather look for these yourself, you can tune out now. And for those who are still going to be watching, we're going to be starting with the Inventor, which is one of the earliest advanced jobs that you could get in the game. And initially I was really confused as to why they were giving us an advanced job this early. And then it hit me. A lot of the materials that you need are going to be a pain in the butt to get until you're leveled up enough to get them. Because to get more of these skills and the support skills in tandem with it, you need to get specific items to craft the skills in order to use them in battle. And because of that, a lot of it can be progress gated, which is fair on its own because it is an advanced job, but you'll find that the amount of viability that you get out of it is going to drastically change depending on how you approach the game. And because of that, it is something worth picking up, but you may not necessarily find a lot of usage outside of just the early game areas, since by the time you get to later game areas where enemies have a lot more gimmicks and shield points and all that stuff, you may not necessarily find that the Inventor is going to be all that useful, because the other caveat with the job is that you can't consistently use these moves. Rather, once you use one of the skills, you have to recharge it, and that takes a turn. And it's not just using any other move. No, you have to select it, and then that's your action for the turn. And some of the moves in particular take more than one turn to recharge, meaning that you're not going to consistently get a lot of usage out of a lot of the stuff here. There's a lot of great skills in here, but the chances of you getting a lot of mileage out of it throughout the entirety of the game is going to greatly differ. However, one thing that you absolutely should do is get the first support skill in a step ahead, which we probably mentioned earlier into the video, but the step ahead support skill basically gives you a free turn before any other turn in the battle. So if you were to give this to every single traveler, which you can do because you don't need to learn these moves through SP, you just have them the moment you craft them, everybody can have access to a step ahead, which basically gives you a free turn of action to set up or do whatever you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Just kind of talking about Inventor quite generally, this is the advanced class that you get access to very early on in the game. If you start with Throne, it's probably the first thing you will encounter in the game, maybe even before any of the other characters. And at the beginning, you only really have access to 2 skills, those being Changeable Catapult and Springy Boots. And while they are very strong, you quickly notice this drawback of having to repair these inventions does mean that Inventor is very much bound to kind of regular combats, rather than sort of being something that you can rely on in bosses. With that said, as you've alluded to, Z, a step ahead is 1,000,000% something that you can rely on. We've sort of talked about it here and there throughout the video already, but this is one of the best support skills. And there are a few reasons for this. One is, as you said, just having an action at the start of battle can be really, really impactful, especially if this is everyone on your party that we're talking about. But the other important thing is, because this is an action that is occurring on its own turn before the kind of full turn that will come after with all the enemy actions, once that first turn ends, everyone that didn't use BP will restore BP. So effectively, if you give a step ahead to one person, you can give a whole extra BP to your entire party, as if you're giving boost start to the entire party, but you're only giving one skill to one unit, and you're getting an extra action out of it. It's incredible. The other synergy that just has to be praised, we've alluded to it already, but Windy Refrain with Agnia, her exclusive skill. If you use a step ahead on Agnia, you can use Windy Refrain and all of your party's actions will be moved to the beginning of the next turn, which means you can just have so much more agency at the start of a battle, whether it's a boss encounter, whether it's just a regular encounter. It gives you so much extra time to set up any support needs that you have, or to dish out damage and maybe even break opponents before they have a chance to act. Honestly, the value of this support skill cannot be overstated. And while it's the kind of thing that I think does have a bit of diminishing returns if you're using it on multiple travelers, just the value that it offers on one traveler alone with that extra BP for the whole party is so incredibly valuable that you'd be a fool not to use it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's because of that I do think that going out of your way to get some of the moves is imperative, especially if you don't end up using Inventor itself. You do have the support skill on everybody once you just unlock 2 extra moves. So you don't even have to have it equipped on anybody if you don't even want to use it. Still, it does have some usage because it is a very, very supportively based job at the end of the day, since it does have an attack which targets everybody, which can be used for breaking. But for the most part, it just enhances your capabilities of your travelers, whether that's through buffs or the other move in Elemental Bomb Battle, which just removes shield points from the enemy, which is always really, really good. Which is why if you do want to use Inventor, we highly recommend that you either put it on Particio, Agnea, or Throne. Particio, again, as we've alluded to in pretty much almost every sub-job, he is your jack of all trades, and if you want to make him support, you can. So that, in tandem with donate BP and hired help and a lot of other stuff, he's not really going to be short on support. Even though in some instances you may want to recharge it through crafting, depending on how many turns it will cost. For the most part, he's already going to be supportive. Adding Inventor on top of it is always just going to be a big benefit. Meanwhile, with Agnea, outside of the dance moves and Windy Refrain, it does pair well with her Latent, which basically grants every single ally the augmented buff. So by using something like Springy Boots with the latent power equipped, you're giving it to everybody in the party, which is really, really good. And as for Throne, we did already talk about how Thief is relatively supportive in nature, and because of that, you can still give her Inventor. And while I personally do think that you're probably going to be better off using something like Hunter on her because you get additional weapon types and more breaking capabilities and debuff potential, you could still use it with Throne since you get it almost immediately if you were to get out of New Delsta, which that's where you start with her. And because of that, I do think Inventor can be worthwhile, with the only added cost of it just not really being great in the long term, or at least for long-term battles where you're going to be in there for dozens of turns.
Inventor is very much about risk-reward when it comes to those longer combats. The other thing to mention with Inventor is it really is something that is influenced by how you're approaching the game when it comes to how quickly you can acquire a lot of these skills. What I mean by this is, to anyone that watched the previous video that Z and I collaborated on, you might remember that we said both of our approaches to playing the game were quite different. Z went for the party of 4 and then used the other 4 as a party for his approach, where he's only really staying with 4 travelers at a time, whereas my approach was sort of recruiting everyone and then cycling out the lowest level member as needed. And what this means is I had access to every path action whenever I needed it, whereas Z was only really focusing on those in his main group of 4. And depending on what path actions you have available, you may find that you're able to pick up a lot of the items that you need for these inventions through different path actions and through a lot of different methods. So really, it's very individual, unless you're doing a sort of very optimized run where you know the location of all of these items. It's very individual in terms of when you're going to get access to specific abilities from Inventor. But, as Zia said, I think prioritizing 4 inventions, the 2 that you start off with and then 2 additional, is really valuable for just getting access to a step ahead. Beyond that, there are some really powerful abilities in this. Arca's Coil, being able to restore a single ally's HP and SP, and grant them BP, and also revive them if they're incapacitated, is incredibly powerful. But obviously your ability to get access to this job will depend on when you can get these items, which may come very late in some instances. Nevertheless, I think Inventor is a job that will excel on characters that already have quite a clearly defined role, because ultimately Inventor doesn't have the endurance to stand up to something like Warrior that can constantly buff and, you know, shave off shield points with Vengeful Blade or something like that. Or Cleric that has a lot of kind of constant defensive utility. Once Inventor has used its main abilities, it doesn't have access to them for a little while. And while you do have ways to mitigate this through other parts of the kit, you do then become much more reliant on your main job, which I think is why those recommendations, Particio, you know, he can always fall back on Donate BP. Agnia can always fall back on buffs with Seal Teej. Those are the instances where Inventor can really find a lot of use. As well as, of course, normal combats, where those cooldowns to repair the inventions are much less of a mitigating factor.
And you nailed it right on the head. And because of that, these are probably the only 3 travelers that we would recommend with Inventor. But again, just building these inventions is already good enough on its own, because getting a step ahead as soon as possible is going to be invaluable just throughout the entire game. If you can, do it. Otherwise, I don't think you're going to miss out on too much, but it's so highly recommended. After the Inventor, we have the Arms Master, which grants access to every physical weapon imaginable. However, the caveat with this class in particular is that all of the abilities are locked behind the weapons that it only synergizes with. And in layman's terms, you need specific weapons to use specific moves. And these also tie in with your support skills. And this is also going to be progress gated, because a majority of the weapons that you have to get are going to be found in a lot of the later game dungeons. Moreover, the ability to unlock Arms Master is through one of the latest towns in the game as is. So it's not something you're going to pick up immediately through something like Inventor, but it's also something that's going to maintain value for pretty much the entire game once you get it, because it has an exuberant amount of damage dealing moves akin to Warrior, with the added benefit of just way better weakness coverage and really, really good support skills.
Yeah, Arms Master is, as anyone that has played Octopath 1 will know, just being able to have access to every weapon type is such a valuable asset. Particularly with the first skill that you, or one of 2 skills that you have access to from the beginning with this class. Sixfold Strike is such a valuable move to just check enemy weaknesses. You know, why use Analyze and check one weakness when you can use Sixfold Strike and then just narrow down to any elemental weaknesses that might be left? Yeah, Arms Master is really potent, and I think I do have some controversial opinions to this, but I'll start with the support skills, because for the most part, these support skills are just going to be staple for any damage dealers. Master of Offense is something that I found a lot of success with. I know there's an accessory that you can get somewhere kind of in the late game that will increase the ability of your, the damage potential of your critical hits. So being able to increase the likelihood of critical hits much more than any other accessory or boost to the critical stat would do, means you're going to be dishing out a lot more damage. Peak performance as well is something that, you know, while maintaining a character's sort of health at max or above might seem difficult, if you can maintain it, adds so much damage to what you can dish out. And once you consider ways of maintaining it, it really isn't that difficult. You know, Temenos with Prayer for Plenty and Seal Teacher Seduction can give the entire party healing above their max HP. At which point, anyone that would benefit from peak performance just needs to be topped up whenever they dip below, and you're constantly getting that damage increase. And lastly, Arms Refinement, I think, is one that is generally much more valuable on the Arms Master themselves, whoever you have given this class to, because really they're going to have the best ability to exploit enemies' weak points. Otherwise, if you're in a situation where maybe you're fighting a challenging boss and you already know their weak points, then you can find value out of it here. But as you've got other sort of more consistent ways of offering latent gauge regeneration through things like the Dancer skills, with Invigorate and Inspire. Generally, this is a little bit less competitive. So yeah, Arms Refinement, while there are sort of other sources of latent power regeneration that I think are a bit more valuable, this can find a lot of use, particularly on your Arms Master. But as for the actual abilities themselves, there's some definite winners and some that I think are a little bit less valuable than others. Cosmic Roar is probably the most interesting of these. What this is a sword attack that is kind of like a charge up. You use it ideally at the beginning of a turn, and then it will activate and deal damage at the end of the turn, with the longer the charge being correlated to the amount of damage that you can do. While this is really strong, there are arguably better sword damage output skills available. Mainly Brand's Blade is the one that's competing with, but Hikari's exclusive skill that you can get towards the end of the game is another one that this really has to compete for. The Spear skill, Giant Swing, is pretty good. It's probably the best AoE option that you have here, given that the sort of gimmick with this one is that the more foes there are, the more potent the attack. And of course, what reason would you have for using an AoE attack unless there are a lot of enemies? So of the two AoE attacks that this class has, I think this one is the more appealing. Mischievous Step, which is the dagger skill, this is one that I think is less useful. What goes on here is that you do 3 attacks, and if there are more foes, you do more attacks. The problem is that this is randomly targeted. So realistically, if all of your foes are weak to dagger, then great, this is a fantastic skill. Otherwise, best case scenario, it's a breaking skill. You're doing 3 dagger attacks to one enemy that is weak to dagger. Otherwise, you're really not getting much value out of the skill. Flurry of Arrows and Deliverance, the sort of bow and staff skills, I think are situational, but, you know, have their uses. The one I really want to hone in on is On the Hunt, which is the axe skill. What this does is 2 hits on a single foe, with the second strike being more powerful, and the more weak points you have revealed, the more potent the attack. Realistically, in most combats, you're going to be able to reveal most, if not all, weak points on an enemy, which means that this damage boost, that kind of all of these skills have a gimmick on how to get more damage or more value out of them. This one is incredibly easy to activate, and the axe itself is, I think, one of the more powerful in terms of base stats. So realistically, this is your premier single target damage output option for Arms Master, and one that I think is among the more appealing of all of these skills.
I don't think I could disagree with that whatsoever. I do think that over the course of the game, you'll probably find that at least when it comes to a majority of the enemies, they'll have at most maybe like 5-6 weaknesses. May vary depending on the area, but you can always expect at least 4 or 5, which means that with a lot of the weaknesses being revealed, and you can do this relatively easily thanks to stuff like Analyze from Oswald or general inference from just how the weapon weaknesses are lined up. By the time you are able to set up a really hard-hitting Lionheart's axe, chances are most of the weaknesses are going to be revealed anyway. There are going to be instances where the bosses can change their weaknesses through their gimmicks, but for the most part, it's going to be relatively the same, which is why I do think, in terms of general damage output, Lionheart's axe is going to be really, really good. You do also have Hunter's Bow, which is still a really good damage-dealing bow, especially in AoE scenarios where the foe could potentially be broken, because if they are able to be broken by this move, you just end up dealing more damage, which is just good. Dealing more damage is good. And otherwise, you have other options, including Sixfold Strike, which can be good for just trying to figure out all physical weaknesses. I don't think that one's going to come into handy as much, but for just setting up all the weaknesses for something like Lionheart's Axe, or just for all your other allies, it's going to be really, really beneficial. And the other one in Spirit Lord's Staff can be really good, but you will need a good elemental attack stack to work with, which I don't necessarily think many characters are going to be able to do.
What do you mean? This is the part where you start introducing Arms Master Oswald as your top recommendation for that reason alone, right? Although, on that topic, are you ready for my controversial opinion of the video? So, naturally, I'm sure people are listening to this thinking, Arms Master, which travelers are going to be the best candidates for this? And 2 will come to mind immediately, and we all know who they are. They're Ochette and they're Hikari. I think Ochette can use this job quite well. I think Hikari is much more of a difficult sell for me. Rather, I think there are other travelers that benefit much more from Arms Master than Hikari. Now, don't get me wrong, Hikari can do fantastic with this subjob. It greatly increases his damage output. You've got all these different powerful physical attacks to take advantage of. You know, you would think it's a match made in heaven. The main reason that I'm kind of in this thinking, in this state of mind, is with Arms Master, you're very constricted in what equipment you can run. You have to use these specific weapons, or you cannot use the skills. Now, for some, it might not be a big deal. You know, the Deliverance, the Staff Attack, maybe we can live without that, right? But for some of the others, you know, sacrificing On the Hunt, sacrificing Giant Swing, that becomes much more of an issue where realistically you're going to want to use all of these weapons, if not most of them. So, my reason for thinking that Hikari is maybe not your choice for Arms Master is because Warrior is already quite a capable job. You've got really good multi-hit sword attacks and aggressive slash, you've got really good damage output from Brand's Blade, and so the other thing that Hikari has going for him at this point, which I think is a really big factor, is he has access to his other exclusive skill, which I will no doubt butcher the pronunciation on, Shinjumon Jigiri, which is a really powerful sword attack that has both AoE and single target aspects to it. So that, on top of all of the existing warrior advantages that we've discussed, on top of all of the learned skills that you have access to, some of which by late game are really potent, it means that ultimately he doesn't need that much more strength to be a really powerful damage dealer, and you're probably going to be better off giving Arms Master to a character that benefits a lot more from it. With that in mind, I think Ochette is probably my favorite option for an Arms Master. Mainly because Hunter is really lacking in a lot of these powerful attacks. You know, Precise Shot is mainly there for breaking, Cleaving Blow is powerful, but, you know, not quite as powerful as some of the other skills that you've got available from Hikari, and the monsters that Ochette can summon, many of them are very powerful, many of them can do very sort of strong buffs and beneficial effects, but not many of them are going to have the immense damage output that something like Shinjumon Jigiri is going to have for Hikari, which is why I think these Arms Master skills are much more appealing for someone like her. With that said, there are other worthwhile Traveler options that I think are worth drawing attention to, my favourites probably being Particio and Throne. Those two sort of having relatively balanced stat lines, but benefiting from a good physical package means that they can really take advantage of a lot of these skills really well.
I do agree with the worthwhile Traveler options being those four in particular, although I do want to mention Throne, since she may not necessarily need the Arms Master to use it because of her EX ability in Disguise. After you beat her story, she's able to copy the job and all the gear of the respective ally that she uses it on, meaning that she could just get Arms Master from another Arms Master. And with Hikari in the party, you could basically have 3 really good offensive units, which is really good. I do at least want to cover Hikari for a second in the sense that because of his learned talent, with the Arms Master, you could basically have every elemental weakness under your belt minus 1 potential element, which you may not necessarily need in the long term anyway. But I do agree that you may want to give it to somebody who's already doing really well on their own. And because Hikari does have access to a really good amount of stuff, including whatever he can learn from his talent, he may not necessarily need the Arms Master, even if he could use it really, really well. And because of that, Particio and Ochette might actually be your best ones. Because again, Particio just has a very fairly balanced stat line, and if you could put him into anything. On top of max BP, he could just output really good damage as soon as you need him to. And with Ochette, well, he basically told you everything you need to know. Throne can also do it if you really need her to, since she can also use her Latent for 2 actions in a single turn and Armor Corrosive, but you could also still use Disguise, which is just as good.
Yeah. The other thing I'll draw attention to as well is, you know, when we're talking about the equipment limitation that this class has, as you sort of find more pieces of equipment later on in the game, you'll notice that there are a lot of considerations to make. Something that I know you've brought up a few times is synergy with equipment that will have buffs towards things like specific elements. You know, maybe someone like Oswald getting benefits from a fire boosting weapon or an ice boosting weapon. Similarly, as you start finishing stories for most of these characters, you'll get access to battle-tested weapons, which are infamously very powerful. And the other one, of course, that I think is unique to this game, I don't remember it from Octopath 1, is series of weapons that have negative stats in some things. Often things like speed or critical or defense, which, if you combine with a specific accessory, you can turn those negative values into positive values. Which means, for someone like Hikari, that equipment limitation that Arms Master imposes becomes much more relevant, because suddenly you have all these really competitive options in battle-tested weapons, in reverse stat weapons that you really want to give to someone that can really take advantage of them. So that's a bit more as to why I think Hikari, obviously a great arms master, but I think there are better options, especially given that you could only give one character this job, unlike the standard subjobs, where you can give up to 3 different subjobs to anyone on your character roster.
Yeah, definitely, which I do agree with. And even if you do give it to Hikari, he's still going to use it really, really well. It's just something that you may want to keep into consideration if you are looking for more offensive capable travelers in just whether it's your A team or your B team. Because of that, I do think the other 3 options are also relatively good on their own too. Although, you may find that Particio may want one of the other 2 not mentioned advanced jobs, since they have a lot of capabilities on their own. Especially the latter, but we'll get to that last. For now, we'll go into the Conjurer, which is a highly supportive base job that pretty much just grants additional elemental damage to every single weapon on all allies. And this can be fire, ice, lightning, wind. The only ones that are missing are dark and light, but you can get those through other means too. And for the most part, these are really good just to have around, especially since it's just free damage for existing. You can already do X amount of damage for whatever class, but these just add on top of it, with the additional benefit of also being able to break. Because if you are short on potential shield poking points before the foe can attack, these could always come in clutch if you are able to target their respective elemental weakness. They also have Prayer for Rain, which restores SP to every single ally after they perform an action, meaning that you won't necessarily have to go out of your way to use items or just other moves that restore SP, since you could just have this for the sake of having it. And then you have BP Boost, which can grant a single ally 2 BP at the start of every turn for 3 turns, which is always going to be great, especially if you were to give it to a merchant who could just constantly donate BP whenever necessary, which is really beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many people that benefit from BP boost. BP really being one of the more valuable things mid-combat. But Conjurer as a whole, for anyone that, played the first game and knows Rune Lord, this is effectively your replacement. With a few trade-offs. You no longer have to use another skill to apply this to the whole party. It will just apply to the whole party naturally, which I think is great. The other thing is these elemental attacks will only ever do 1 hit per enemy per attack. So if you hit 1 enemy 3 times with Aggressive Slash, it'll still only do 1 Conjuration attack. On the whole though, these are really potent effects. It's also worth noting that the Conjuration damage will scale off of the elemental attack of whoever has inflicted it, which means characters like Oswald, Agnia, Temenos, they really benefit from having these buffs. And also worth noting that the Conjurations, I think it's between 2 and 5 turns based on max on boost level, but do benefit from the Dancer support skills, the Show Goes On, and Invigorate and Inspire. So really lots of beneficial synergies to help kind of bolster support that this class can offer. The only other one that you the only other skills you didn't really mention are Dance of Immunity and Rite of the Sun. They kind of have their uses. Dance of Immunity is similar to Rehabilitate in the sense that it kind of gives that immunity, though for buffs rather than status afflictions. Though realistically, it's hard to find a lot of use out of it. Same with Rite of the Sun, not being able to act for several turns is a really major drawback. When it comes to the support skills for Conjurer, I think you've got a lot of appealing options here. The big ones being SP Saver and BP Regeneration. SP Saver just being a flat 50% reduction on the equipping character's skills. Incredibly appealing for characters like Agnia, who have high SP costs from things like Divine Skills, Windy Refrain, etc. Temenos loves this as well, especially if he has to dip into particularly high SP cost things like Revive. And the class that we will talk about momentarily also has a lot to benefit from it. Scholar as well, the other one that, has a lot of appealing kind of aspects to this support skill. BP Regeneration as well. It's inconsistent. It's a 25% chance to recover the amount of BP you use whenever you do an action. And while this can be incredibly powerful for situations where perhaps you use a divine skill and then you restore all of the BP that you have just used from that. If you're Cleric Agnia, suddenly you can do Seal Teacher's Seduction followed by Elfric's Blessing really easily. It can be incredibly powerful, but consistency is a concern. So for some, they may prefer to just, run a support skill that they can have a bit more consistency with. But when this does work, it's incredibly powerful. So what are your thoughts, Z, on who can really take advantage of the Conjurer's Kit the best?
I think this is probably one of the most flexible classes in the game, mainly because it does something similar with the Warrior and the Dancer in that it focuses on one thing and that one thing only. And that for this instance, it's going to be support. And because of that, you could basically take every single support unit and just use them that way. Or you could take some of the ones that could go into either role and make them into support. So characters such as Agnia, Casti, Particio, Throne, and Temenos can all use this really well. So Agnia, she's already supportive in nature with the Dancer ability, so with this she can provide additional support with the class and the added benefit of being able to use Dagger Dance and deal damage herself. So for example, using something like Dagger Dance with a Conjurer of Flames means that you can inflict fire damage on every single enemy with just the AoE, which is really beneficial in that regard. The same thing can also be done with Casti and her Sweeping Cleave, which is really beneficial too, although she also can be supportive in nature. So if you wanted to give her the Conjure of Flames or Conjure of Ice or any sort of Conjure, or BP boost if you don't want to use Concoct, you have the flexibility to do so, even though Concoct is still really good anyway. Meanwhile, with Particio, as we've said with basically every class, I feel like every single class, he could be supportive and combative, and with Conjurer, it just exemplifies the flexibility. Throne, she doesn't really have any AoE moves, which does suck in that aspect, but with the Conjurer job, she could still provide a modicum of support, thanks to the Thief's innate moves, which is really just going to be Shackle Foe and Armor Corrosive, which are still going to be good no matter what. And then with Temenos, he already has a really good elemental attack stat, meaning that the potency of the Conjure is going to be exemplified comparatively to other characters that don't have as much elemental attack. But also he's supportive in nature because that's how clerics are, so I think he'd be a really natural fit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're all great options. My favorite is probably Agnia. The main reason being that the sort of synergy I mentioned with The Show Goes On and Invigorate and Inspire means you're constantly able to extend these conjurations, you're able to help fill latent power gauges, and it supplements everything that Agnia already wants to do. You know, BP boost helps accelerate getting divine skills out. That's exactly what Agnia is looking to do with things like Seal Teacher Seduction. Not only for herself, but also for partners like Temenos. BP boost as well, I think, is something that Agnia really benefits from. You know, Seal Teacher Seduction is such a powerful divine skill, and being able to give this BP regeneration effect to help accelerate the speed at which she can get those buffs out is really significant. Not only for her own sake, but also for partners like Temenos, who would really value the extra utility. But yeah, all really great options. I think Conjurer is definitely a very appealing class that you would be very hard-pressed to turn down in most endgame compositions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that really goes with pretty much every advanced job, maybe outside of Inventor, but Inventor still has a lot of use regardless of whether or not you're using that class. However, there is one final class that we haven't gone over that has arguably some of the most value in the entire game, and that's the Arcanist, which grants daggers and staves, as well as an exuberant amount of supportive capabilities in the form of Seal of Diffusion, which extends the reach of skills that only target the user to every single ally, and Seal of Inversion, which reverses the debuffs on any ally to positive buffs. However, Seal of Diffusion is arguably going to be the craziest part about it, because if you remember anything from Octopath Traveler 1, it was the Rune Lord, and when paired up with the Merchant Sidestep, you can basically grant everybody Sidestep, meaning that you were basically immune to physical attacks for as long as you had Sidestep up, and it only increased with BP boosts, meaning that Particio in particular, he can uphold the legacy of Rune Lord Tressa and go with Arcanist and grant everybody Sidestep, which is extremely valuable because you could basically mitigate one specific weapon type, which is insane.
Yeah, to all the people that have gotten this far in the video and they're thinking, what about Rune Lord Tressa? Where's something that can rival the legacy of such a powerful combination? Arcanist is what you've been waiting for. The amount of tools that this class has in its kit is insane. You've already mentioned Seal of Diffusion with Sidestep. It's everyone's favorite combo from the first game, back with a vengeance. But I think the craziest thing about Arcanist is the Divine Skill. The Divine Skill, Seal of Eternity. which makes a single buff last until the end of the battle. Now, this does come with the high BP cost of using the skill, and it does come with a high SP cost as well. But Seal of Eternity can work with divine skills, meaning you can extend Aelfric's Blessing to get another action at the end of your turn, permanently to the end of the battle. The same with Seal Teege, the same with Dota. All of these incredibly powerful skills, you now only need to set them up once. And then once you extend them with Seal of Eternity, that's it. No need to worry. And of course, as soon as you get one, maybe two of these buffs out, it's incredibly easy to get the rest of them out. You know, Aelfric's Blessing, just being able to take another action, imagine that, except you set it up on your Arcanist first, all of a sudden they're getting more actions, or maybe your Merchant, you're donating more BP. It just accelerates the setup that you can do drastically. And as soon as you don't have to worry about maintaining uptime on these powerful effects, you can then shift your focus on the immense defensive capability that other classes can have. You know, all of a sudden, Temenos is sitting there with Aelfric's Blessing, Seal Teacher's Seduction permanently, and he can just, you know, benefit from maybe BP boost from Conjurer, just getting all the BP he needs, setting up, you know, Sacred Shield, Prayer to the Flame, all of these tools to just make your party completely untouchable, on top of things like Reflected Barrier, which is, you know, people who remember Drysang from Octopath 1. This was a very popular method for beating that fight. And it's just as powerful here, you know? Also benefits from Seal Teacher's Seduction, can be cast on the whole party. Honestly, the amount of capabilities that Arcanist can wield is immense. And that's before we even talk about the damaging parts of its kit.
I think you said it better than I could. I was already focused on Sidestep because it gave me good flashbacks to Runelord Tressa. But yeah, you can basically break the entirety of any battle because of everything that Arcanist can apply to the party. And the only thing you need is just an additional ally, which you're going to be running anyway. So having Particio in particular with the Arcanist ability is going to be extremely valuable, not only in parts of just how he can be anything in particular, but I think what sells it the most is going to be his latent ability, which just maxes out his BP immediately. So with the right setup, you can have this Seal of Eternity on turn 1, which is extremely strong. Although if you wanted to use this for more than just, I don't know, support, you could also give it to Oswald, who's already a pretty decent solid damage dealer because of all his coverage from the Scholar. But with Arcanist, you get access to an additional Dark Spell and Light Spell, which not only deal a really good amount of damage to every single foe, but it also heals HP to every single ally and restores SP to every single ally, depending on which one you use.
Yeah, absolutely. And worth noting as well, another reason why Oswald in particular loves Arcanist is these spells can also be enhanced with Advanced Magic and Aliphan's Wisdom. So, with tier 3 spells, you can hit all of the foes on the opponent's side of the field 3 times and restore HP, or SP, depending on which one you use. It really does make this a much more offense-focused class if you are looking to get more sort of coverage and damage out of it, rather than all of the support abilities. But really, Arcanist, when you consider many of the skills that we've already talked about from other classes, you know, Inventor's a step ahead to effectively give the whole party 1 BP extra at the start of combat. Then you consider maybe we'll run Boost Start as well, so that after that step ahead turn, your character might already have 3 BP, which means they can already cast a Divine skill. Maybe if you use Boost Start on another character who's running Arcanist, then you can extend it on turn 1. Honestly, the possibilities with this are endless, and this is where I think it really does kind of lean into this, you know, the imagination is really the limiting factor here. Another one I want to talk about is Casty's exclusive skill, which what this does is it pretty much just gives random effects to someone on your team. It's similar to Stroke of Genius in that sense, but what's different about Casty's Remedy is that this can include divine skill effects. And the reason I bring this up is because naturally Arcanist is going to be very BP hungry, and you're really going to struggle to maintain a lot of BP while getting all of these powerful divine skill effects up which you then intend to extend. So using something like Casti with Seal Tige and Remedy to give all of these crazy effects to everyone on your party to then extend with Arcanist, it can get really crazy. But honestly, I think this is the sub-job that kind of leans into that territory of, sacrificing balance for fun. And while I don't think that's a bad thing, I think it does depend on how far do you want to go with all of this elaborate setup. Because realistically, Octopath Traveler 2 is an incredibly fun game, but it's not the most difficult if you're at or above the level requirements or recommendations for all of the parts of the story. And while there are challenges that, you can take on after the main stories, things like Arcanist extending, Seal Tige, Dota, and Elfric's Blessing on one character, and then setting that up for all four, at that point, the fight was over 10 turns ago. So, an exceptional class. Really, when you combine it with all of the little support skills and advantages that we've discussed up to this point, you can create some insane synergies with this thing. It just remains to be seen how relevant or how important many of those are.
I really don't see how any of these are going to remain irrelevant, at least when it comes to just granting everybody any sort of divine skill. That's really... I don't see how that's bad. I know that in the final boss fight in Octopath Traveler 1, there is a single move on the second phase that can remove every single buff, and maybe they bring it back here. However, I find that generally you're not going to be running into many issues, especially if you are able to just set up really, really early in and then do what you need to do. And at that point, you just won, like you said, 10 turns ago. And really, I find that because of that, Arcanist is one of those must-haves on any sort of team. And not just a must-have, it's either a must-have on Oswald or Particio, because I find that out of any single Traveler in the entirety of the game, these are the only two that are going to give you the most consistent results. Especially since, A, for the offensive purposes, you don't really have a lot of good magic damage dealers, and Oswald's your highest one. And B, support-wise, Particio is arguably going to be the best one because he could pair it up with his base merchant. So when it comes to just general effectiveness in what you can accomplish both offensively and supportively, I think these two are the top echelon when it comes to Arcanist.
Yeah, I would agree. If you were to really try and come up with an argument for any other Travelers, I think the two that come to mind would probably be Agnia and Temenos. The main issue with that is, I think Agnia in particular really benefits from Conjurer. Or Cleric, mainly something that can help just focus her in on her support capability, whereas realistically with Arcanist, you want someone else to be the one extending those support capabilities with Seal of Eternity. It's just too much of a BP demand to be the one setting up Seal Tige and then also extending it. Temenos, there's an argument for, but unlike Oswald, he gets much less benefit out of the spells that Arcanist has. He doesn't have a way to innately enhance them. And similarly, Elfric's Blessing is one of the things that you can really take advantage of with Seal of Eternity. So again, he's kind of got the same situation as Agnia, where he would prefer someone else to help enable his support. The other thing that is worth clarifying before we go into the support skills is Seal of Eternity, from my testing, doesn't work on anything that requires you to set up charges of it. So what I mean by that is things like Sidestep, things like Vengeful Blade, Alaphan's Wisdom and Advanced Magic, as those kind of operate on a charge system as well. You won't be able to extend any of those with Seal of Eternity. However, with the effects that you already can extend, I think we can live without them.
Yeah, I think there's so much you really need before the fight just becomes you're kicking a horse while it's down. Oh wait, that's not the saying, but I'm gonna keep it in. But really, those are the only two Travelers I would most likely recommend it on. Again, you could get away with it on other characters, but I do think for the best mileage, you're gonna get it out of these two. Especially when it comes to some of the support skills that you can get, whether that's SP recovery, which can be really good if you're dealing damage. So if you give it to Oswald and you're using it with Alaphan's Enlightenment, chances are you're gonna recover a good amount of SP, even outside of whatever he's already doing from Blessing. Otherwise, you have Price of Power, which consumes double the amount of SP, but increases the amount of damage of the spells, which is going to be extremely good for those who use magic, aka Oswald, because he's pretty much primarily magic. Otherwise, you have 2 other support skills that you may not really get use of. Lasting Memory, which just keeps status effects even when they become incapacitated, which is fine, but I don't think you really want to give it up for a lot of other support slots. And of Equal Might, which can balance the physical attack and elemental attack of the equipping character for whatever is higher, but it doesn't really include anything from equipment. So if you already do a fair amount of damage as a magic dealer, so if it's extremely lopsided and you want to use some other physical move, it's probably fine in that regard, but it basically turns your character into another Particio with the cost of a support slot, and that's okay, but it's only really going to matter if you're able to consistently do both physical and elemental damage.
You're shattering my dreams of Arms Master Oswald here. I didn't think you had it in you, but yeah, thinking about it more actually, one other Traveler I think you could maybe make an argument for as a good user of Arcanist would be Throne. And the reason for that being Hex, which isn't something we've talked about much, but what this does is it extends the duration of debuffs on foes. And really this can be useful for if you're really just trying to neuter an opponent, you know, set up Armor Corrosive, set up Shackle Foe, and then just keep both of those effects extended as much as possible. Especially with Throne's latent power, you know, she can just take advantage of that action economy so well to really cripple enemy opponents with those debuffs. So having access to Hex to extend them and kind of make maintaining them a bit easier can be a benefit. Plus, if that's Throne's main role, then arguably she has a bit more time to set up things like Seal of Eternity for the units that generally want to spend their time actually offering support rather than extending support.
In worst case scenario, you could always use the Disguise EX skill that you get from Throne if you just want to copy the Hex and still just not have to give up your job slot for anything else. But that also comes with its own like drawbacks and benefits or whatever. But for the most part, you really won't go wrong if you were to use it on Oswald or Particio. And to be honest, I do think you're better off just using Disguise on one of them. So at the very least, you could just grab Hex, which can still be really good with her latent power of being able to act 2 times back to back, which is really good. And that seems to be it when it comes to the Arcanist and pretty much every sub-job, unless you have anything else to add.
I guess one thing, I can't remember if we mentioned it, and I'm pretty sure this is the case, but I think Seal of Eternity applies to a random buff on a target. So if you are taking advantage of this incredibly powerful effect, the one thing that you do need to be aware of is making sure that you're setting up, you know, whatever skill that you want to extend, probably something like Elfric or Sealtige, making sure that that's the only buff you have on your target. Otherwise, you may up spending all of this BP extending something that you didn't intend to.
Yeah, and that's something you should keep in mind, which is why we generally recommend that if you're going to do it, you do it as soon as possible. Because chances are, it's going to be one of the first things that you inflict or buff on yourself. So just getting it out of the way is going to be a lot better, especially for RNG's sake. Where if you do mess up a Seal of Eternity because of it, it's not going to bode well for a good while. And that's really about it when it comes to all the sub-jobs. It was a lot of talking, in fact, and if you sat through it, then props to you, because I'm sure this video is going to be at least over an hour long, which is a lot for anybody to just sit down and listen to. But at the very least, I am hoping that you got something good out of it, because the intention of this video is just to provide as much help as possible, because anybody who came from 1 may know that the super final boss was like a massive difficulty spike for those who were like completely caught off guard. Some people probably did better than others, but for the most part, it's a pretty wide consensus that it's like really, really difficult. So hopefully with this sub-job guide, you'll be able to manage a lot more. And if you did get something out of it, make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure to check out Lunair's channel in the description below. He's maybe gonna eventually make another video. I'm hoping he does, because they're really good. But also make sure to sub to me, because that's the most important part. Kidding aside.
And I guess a closing remark on all of this as well is, you know, we've now talked at length about all of these different combinations and, you know, possible synergies you can pull off with all of these sub-jobs. But, you know, hopefully for the people that got sort of powerful combos and sort of effective strategies out of it, there are also some fun strategies in there as well, you know. Things like your warrior Oswald with Vengeful Blade, or your springy boots Agnia with Latent Power, you know. Because that, I think, is one of the real advantages of this game. Just, you know, pushing that fun factor to its max with all of these fascinating combos. And while some of them can be very fun, some of them can also be very effective. And hopefully we've done a good job of giving a good mix of both.
Yeah, and that's the goal in all of this. So if you liked it, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.